For decades, the Assad family ruled Syria with an iron fist. Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father, took power in a coup in 1970. He established a one-party state dominated by the Ba'ath Party. His rule was marked by brutal repression and a crackdown on any dissent. When Hafez died in 2000, his son Bashar al Asaad inherited the presidency. Initially, Bashar, a British-trained ophthalmologist, offered hope for reform. He promised greater openness and political freedom. However, these hopes were quickly dashed. Bashar tightened his grip on power, mirroring his father's authoritarian style. He continued the suppression of opposition and maintained the family's iron grip on Syria. The Assad's rule, while oppressive, maintained a level of stability in Syria. The country, however, remained on edge. Beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Years of political repression, economic inequality and social injustice had created a powder keg waiting to explode. The Arab Spring of 2011 provided the spark. In a matter of weeks, the seemingly unshakable Assad regime crumbled. The rapid collapse in December 2024 shocked the world. It marked a dramatic end to the decades-long rule of the Assad dynasty. The final offensive was swift and decisive. Rebel forces, consolidated under a unified command, launched a surprise attack from their stronghold in Idlib. They exploited the weakened state of the Syrian army, catching them off guard. The rebels faced minimal resistance as they advanced on Damascus, the capital city. Assad's forces, depleted and demoralized, simply couldn't hold back the tide. The speed of the collapse surprised even seasoned observers. Many had predicted a protracted battle for Damascus. Instead, the city fell with a whimper. The once feared security apparatus of the Assad regime evaporated. Government buildings stood empty, abandoned by officials who fled or switched sides. The Syrian army, once a formidable force in the region, had been bled dry by years of relentless conflict. The Syrian civil war, raging since 2011, had taken a devastating toll. Estimates suggested that the army had lost half of its 300,000 soldiers. Casualties were high, defections were rampant. Draft dodging was widespread. The Syrian army was a shadow of its former self. Morale was at an all-time low. Soldiers, poorly equipped and underpaid, were disillusioned. Corruption was rampant within the ranks. The army was plagued by a lack of resources and a breakdown in logistics. Even a last-minute attempt to boost morale with a 50% pay raise failed to have any impact. The Syrian economy, ravaged by years of war and international sanctions, was in ruins. The government simply couldn't afford to properly equip or support its military. The army's depleted state made it vulnerable to the rebel offensive. The soldiers, lacking the will to fight, offered little resistance as the rebels advanced. Russia, a longtime ally of the Assad regime, played a crucial role in propping up the Syrian government throughout the civil war. Russian air power proved decisive in turning the tide in favor of Assad on numerous occasions. However, in the final days of the regime, Russian support was noticeably absent. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 had overstretched its military resources. The conflict in Ukraine became a quagmire for the Russian military. It forced the Kremlin to prioritize its resources and attention on the conflict closer to home. This shift in focus had significant implications for Syria. With Russia preoccupied with Ukraine, the Assad regime lost its most powerful benefactor. Russian air support, which had been instrumental in countering rebel advances, dwindled. The absence of Russian air cover left the Syrian army exposed and vulnerable. The rebels, sensing an opportunity, capitalized on Russia's distraction. Section 5. Pressure from the south. Israel's shadow war weakens Hezbollah. Another key factor in the fall of the Assad regime was the weakening of Iran and its Lebanese proxy, Hezbollah. Both had been staunch allies of Assad, providing vital military support throughout the Syrian civil war. However, a series of well-coordinated Israeli attacks throughout 2024 significantly degraded their capabilities. Israel, viewing Iran's growing influence in Syria as a direct threat to its national security, had been waging a shadow war against Iranian targets in the country for years. These attacks intensified in 2024, targeting Hezbollah's leadership and infrastructure. The strikes aimed to disrupt the flow of Iranian weapons to Hezbollah and weaken its ability to operate in Syria. The Israeli attacks took a heavy toll on Hezbollah. They assassinated key commanders, destroyed valuable weapons stockpiles, and disrupted supply lines. The group was forced to divert resources and attention away from Syria to counter the Israeli threat. As the rebel offensive gained momentum, Hezbollah, weakened and under pressure, withdrew its remaining forces from Syria. Their departure further eroded Assad's dwindling support base. Section 6. A united front, al-Jawlani's rise as rebel leader. The success of the final rebel offensive can be attributed in part to the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, a veteran jihadist commander. Al-Jawlani rose to prominence as the leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a powerful Islamist faction operating in northwestern Syria. He played a pivotal role in uniting the disparate rebel groups under a single banner. Prior to al-Jawlani's rise, the Syrian opposition was plagued by infighting and a lack of cohesion. Rivalries between secular and Islamist groups, as well as competition for resources and influence, hampered their ability to present a united front against Assad. Al-Jawlani recognized that a fractured opposition would never succeed in toppling the regime. Through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, military victories, and ideological maneuvering, al-Jawlani managed to consolidate his power and influence. He forged alliances with other rebel groups, marginalized rivals, and presented HTS as a viable alternative to the Assad regime. Under his leadership, the rebels were able to launch a coordinated and effective offensive that ultimately led to the collapse of the Assad regime. Section 7. The world reacts from triumph to calculated analysis. The fall of the Assad regime sent shockwaves across the international community. Reactions were mixed, ranging from jubilation to cautious optimism and wary skepticism. World leaders weighed in on the events in Syria, offering their interpretations of the situation and its implications for the region. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was quick to claim victory, attributing Assad's downfall to Israel's relentless campaign against Iran and Hezbollah. He argued that Israel's actions had significantly weakened Assad's allies, ultimately tipping the balance of power in favor of the opposition. His remarks reflected Israel's long-standing concerns about Iranian influence in Syria. U.S. President Joe Biden, while acknowledging the significant role played by the Syrian opposition, emphasized the contribution of the United States and its allies in weakening Assad's backers. He argued that years of diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and targeted military strikes had degraded the capabilities of the Syrian government and its allies, paving the way for the opposition's victory. Section 8. Syria in Flames, a history of conflict. The collapse of the Assad regime marked a dramatic turning point in the Syrian civil war, a conflict that had raged for over a decade. The war's roots could be traced back to the Arab Spring of 2011, a wave of pro-democracy uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa. In Syria, the protest began in March 2011, sparked by the arrest and torture of a group of teenagers who had painted revolutionary slogans on a school wall in the southern city of Daraa. The government's brutal crackdown on the peaceful protests fueled the flames of dissent, pushing the country towards the brink of civil war. The Syrian conflict quickly escalated into a complex and multifaceted civil war, drawing in regional and international actors. The war became a proxy battleground for competing powers, with the United States, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia all vying for influence. Section 9. Scars of War, a Nation in Ruins. The Syrian civil war left an indelible mark on the country, transforming it from a relatively stable nation into a devastated and fragmented land. The conflict claimed the lives of an estimated 500,000 people, leaving countless others injured, displaced, and traumatized. The war triggered a humanitarian crisis of catastrophic proportions. Over half of Syria's pre-war population of 23 million was displaced, with millions seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. The fighting reduced cities to rubble, destroyed infrastructure, and crippled the economy. The fall of the Assad regime, while marking the end of an era, did not signal the end of the conflict. Syria remained a deeply divided and war-torn nation. The country faced a long and arduous road to recovery. The scars of war, both physical and psychological, would take generations to heal. The international community faced the daunting task of rebuilding Syria and fostering a lasting peace in the war-torn nation.